Games between very strong grandmasters are not always pretty, but they can nevertheless be very instructive and entertaining. Hello everyone, this is Andrew Martin and welcome to my BCM Game of the Month for May 2013. The game I'm featuring comes from the FIDE Grand Prix tournament currently taking place in Zug, Switzerland. A very strong event that features 12 of the world's strongest grandmasters who are all rated in excess of 2700. This is a very open event. Any of these fine players could win. But the game I'm showing comes from round 2 and it's between Topalov and Topalov-Leko. You couldn't call this a pretty game, but it nevertheless will hold your interest throughout, I'm sure. Well, Topalov played d4 and we got a Rogozin variation of the Queen's Gambit on the board. Well, I'm not sure whether you could call this a Queen's Gambit or a Nimzo Indian. It has elements of each. This is a very active system by Black. White usually tries to take advantage of the absence of the bishop from e7 by pinning the knight on f6. And now Black nudges the bishop away from the queen side so that he can strike with c5. So here we have a typical position for this line. Black's pawn structure in the centre is much looser than it normally would be in the Queen's Gambit, but in return he's got very active play. And Leko continues in this active style by pushing forward immediately with c4. Now clearly when Black plays c4 here, he's setting up ideas of putting pressure on the knight at c3. And the way he can do this is to play g5, then he puts his queen out on a5, then he sticks his knight in on e4. And if White allows this sequence, then he can get into a terrible mess. Let's just get rid of these arrows for a moment, because there is another feature of the position that is very relevant here, and that is the establishment of a queenside pawn majority by Black. Already at this stage, Black is thinking about winning endgames. He's set up a position where he can start to push this majority down the board in the middle game, and if White isn't very careful, he can get into a light squared bind. And so White has already got to make some delicate choices. Well, Topalov played knight to d2. That's a good move in all respects. It covers e4. It breaks the pin on the knight at c3. And it makes room for White's queen to come out, should that be necessary. Black, for his part, continues in the active style of this variation by nudging the bishop back. And now before queen f3, Leko gets to put his bishop on f5. And now this is the first parting of the ways, because White's got several moves here. He can play bishop e2. That's been played quite frequently. And that's a logical move. The only drawback of that is that, of course, White's blocked his queen in now. He can't play queen f3. White can also play h4. That has been played quite a bit. And one of the latest examples of the game Nybak versus Kulots, Finland 2012, where a very unclear position was reached. After rook g8, White opened up the h-file, played bishop e5. Black took on c3, and then knight bd7, queen f3, bishop g6, and now White took on f6, forcing knight takes f6, and then played queen to g3. With a very active location for the queen, probably queen e5 check is coming. There's also a very interesting move here, the non-stereotypical move, bishop takes b8. That was played in the game Chiburdanidze versus Zhu Yuhua Doha 2011. And again, this was a very interesting idea, you know. It seems counterproductive to get rid of the dark square bishop at this stage, but White wants to bring the queen out and then strike with h4 before Black can even get those queenside pawns rolling. And in this game, we got a very interesting position. Black took this pawn. White went queen f4. Black went b5. More to give the rook a bit of room to come up to b6 than anything else. And after bishop e2, rook e6, rook takes h4, the position was simply unclear. Although White actually went on to win this game. Going back to our featured game, Topalov played bishop e5. And that is another option. Black took on c3. Knight bd7, and now to make this variation independent, Topalov played bishop d6. He doesn't want to commit his queen just yet, nor his bishop on f1. Instead, he puts his bishop on an awkward diagonal from Black's perspective, trapping the Black king in the middle. So Leko, over the next couple of moves, tries to shift the bishop from the diagonal. or at the very least drives it back to a worse square on a3, where it could fall prey to black's advancing pawns on the queen side. So Leko's moves make sense. He gains time on the bishop, he starts the advance of the pawns, now he puts his rook in behind the b pawn, threatening to play b4, swamping the bishop. Topalov, for his part, decides to play for e4, or at least to set the idea up by playing f3, although that seems to run into b4, bishop b2, castles. And it might seem here as though black has got a pretty good position. Over the last 10 moves or so, he just seems to have gained quite a bit of time on white's bishop, errant dark square bishop, and push white back on the queen side. But this position's a bit deceptive because black's king position is very loose, and white can open up the game with a well-timed e4 very speedily indeed. So Topalov continues to prepare e4, I would say, by first of all playing rook c1, and after knight b6, prophylactically retreating his bishop to a1. And it seems scarcely possible here that white could be better, really, because that bishop on a1 is buried. But as I say, this is a little bit deceptive, as after a move like e4, if black takes it, a sudden c takes b4 is not only going to bring the bishop to life, it's going to open up fire against black's pawn on c4. So whilst the position of the bishop on a1 looks ridiculous, the bishop does have surprising prospects there. Now Leko played queen to e6. Just to give you a flavour of what white can do here, if black plays rook fe8, then I think white can go e4. And if takes, we take back. Now the f file's open. And if black takes on e4, we can take on c4 and then take on b4 with a very interesting position. So just going back, queen e6 was played in the game. Just, I think, to get the queen off the c file. And white went into action anyway with the move e4. And black took. Now, I must admit, if I was black here, I would certainly have given bishop g6 due consideration. And the point of that move, the main point, is to keep the bishop buried on a1. So, for instance, I'm sure Topalov didn't do that, Leko didn't do that because of the move e5. But I think black can actually get away with this. And if white starts to march forward thematically in the centre, then black can play f6. And all is definitely not clear in this position, because that bishop on a1 is going to take a heck of a lot of reintroducing into the game. And black's got some counterplay on the king side. Leko in the game took on e4. Topalov took on b4. Black recaptured. White took on e4. Knight takes e4. And now bishop takes c4. After which Leko played knight to d5. Well, black could have taken that bishop and then plonked his knight in on c3. This was definitely another way, although once again it gives the bishop on a1 something to do. White would certainly hoover that knight off at high speed, and then he could perhaps play d5. Now we've got a very open struggle, and after queen e4, rook takes c3, rook b1, white's got to be very careful here. He doesn't play queen takes b1, after which queen d4 check wins immediately. No, he's probably got to play queen d2, and then we get a merely unclear position after takes on f1, rook b8, rook c1, rook c8, and now knight to e3. I think I prefer white here. So that's probably why black in the game played knight to d5, anxious to keep the blockade in the centre. So white played knight b3, black played bishop g6, knight c5, queen to d6, and now the queen came out to f3. Black played rook fe8 to prevent any capture on e4, and now white played knight to a6, hitting the rook. Rook came to b7, and the forcing sequence continued when Topalov took on d5 and then played knight to c7. And on the face of it, this looks good for white because he's winning the exchange. In actuality, I'm not at all sure that this position is better for white at all, because black's got very active pieces. He's defending f7, and he's got threats of his own, notably pushing this past pawn. So I think both sides have got to be extremely careful in this situation. Now white played queen to h3. Note also the black queen's covering f7. and this is a very important trump. Moreover, white can't get his queen on the long diagonal. I mean, he can flick in a move like d5, but then I think black just takes it. So going back to the game, white played queen to h3. Black brought his queen back into the centre, allowing Topalov to take on h6. This is a deflection, giving black time to get counterplay here with knight to c3. White parked his king in the corner. Topalov played queen f5. Again, I think we've got merely an unclear position here with everything to play for. Obviously, white can't take that queen because of rook e1 mate. So he had to put his rook on a passive square. And now black sets up mating threats by playing knight e4. Everything's hinging on white not being able to play d5 here and reintroduce that bishop into the game. So rook c2. Already that looks like a rather unstable square for the rook. Black gains time on the rook. And now white seems like he's just bought enough time to play d5 to weaken the second rank, and now rook e2. Well, what we have here is an extremely messy situation, very difficult to call. Black played bishop to f7 here. He could equally have considered the move king f7. The king is much safer on that square than it looks. He's actually acting as a defender here, and if white pushes forward with d6, then we have knight g3 check. If white takes, black takes on e2, d7, and then rook d2 covers. King h2, and we get a rather unclear situation after queen g4, rook c6, queen h5. Probably this sort of thing is going to end in a draw. Although black's a little better, should be a draw. Leko feels he's better, goes boldly on for the win. White pushes the pawn forward, and now queen to g6. Again, even at move 40, there were complicated alternatives. Black could play bishop d5 here, allowing d7. And if rook d8, rook c1, then we have bishop b7. There are some threats here, which white cannot ignore. Going back to the game. Queen g6 was played. Off came the queens. And now d7. It may have been that rook ge1 was a better move. And if knight takes d6, we have bishop takes f6. Suddenly the bishop comes to life, and I think white is better again. So this has been a very murky struggle. White pushes on, black plays rook to d8, white puts his rook in behind the passed pawn, and black brings his king up. White makes room for his own king to come into the fray and restricts black's pawns. Knight c5, and now the rook came into d6. There's a little bit of toing and froing as both sides manoeuvre. White tries to get his rooks into better positions. Black, meanwhile, takes a pawn. White goes rook e3. Black played f5. And now after bishop b2, f takes g4, black seems to be on top as white is running out of pawns. But suddenly, in this opposite colour bishop situation, the black king finds itself very, very short of cover. And after rook e7, the tables are turning. Well, Leko played rook e8. I mean, I don't know what the time control was at this stage, whether black was getting short of time. But it turns out that this loss of the knight on d7 settles things. As, although black comes down and hits the poor bishop on b2, it's the black king that is starting to feel the heat. Leko makes room. Topalov shuts him down. Leko blocks. Rook e6. Suddenly, black is out of time and he's out of position. He tried b2. White just took it off. And seeing that now he's a rook up, he's going to be a rook up for nothing, Leko resigned. Well, I think I could have spent possibly a fair bit longer on this game. On the BCM channel, we're limited to 15-minute takes, and this was a 58-move game. But it must have been a very tiring and exhausting struggle for both players. Nevertheless, I think it was rather interesting. One intriguing point of this game, for me, was the way that bishop was buried on a1 for most of the game, yet it had a pivotal role to play in winning the game for white. So a very interesting game all the way through.